Karen lived in a suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everything seemed neat and orderly. She liked it that way. Rules were meant to be followed. And in Karen's world, everyone should live exactly as she did. So, when a family bought the piece of land just outside the HOA's boundaries and turned it into a small farm, Karen was furious. To her, farms didn't belong near her pristine neighborhood, and she saw the animals and crops as an eyesore. Karen had no problem expressing her dissatisfaction to anyone who would listen. She marched up and down the street, complaining about the farm to her neighbors. "Can you believe they're letting that mess grow right next to us?" she'd ask, her voice dripping with disgust. "We need to do something about this." But the farm wasn't causing any harm. It wasn't even that big, just a few chickens, some goats, and rows of vegetables. The family who owned it kept everything tidy, and the animals stayed on their side of the property line. Most of the neighbors didn't mind the farm at all. Some even enjoyed the fresh eggs and produce the family offered to share. This only made Karen more frustrated. She couldn't stand that people were okay with it. In her mind, the farm was ruining the entire neighborhood, and she wasn't going to let it slide. She began watching the farm closely, waiting for any reason to complain. Every cluck from a chicken, every bleat from a goat, made her blood boil. One day, Karen saw what she believed was her golden opportunity. The goats had wandered near the property line, and though they hadn't crossed over, Karen decided this was her chance to take action. She grabbed her phone, dialed 911, and reported the farm for creating a public disturbance. The police arrived within minutes. 2 officers stepped out of their car and approached the farm, where the family was busy tending to their crops. The sight of flashing lights caught the attention of the entire neighborhood. People peered through their windows, curious to see what was going on. Karen, watching from a distance, smirked in satisfaction. The officers approached the family, looking around to assess the situation. "We got a call about a disturbance," one of the officers said, his tone professional but confused. There didn't seem to be anything wrong. The goats were calmly grazing in their enclosure, and the chickens clucked peacefully in the coop. The family, surprised by the visit, politely asked what the issue was. The officer glanced over at the goats and then back at his partner, clearly unsure of what the problem could be. "Apparently, someone in the neighborhood reported that your animals were causing a disturbance," he explained. The family assured the officers that their animals were well contained and had never caused any trouble. They even invited the officers to take a closer look around the farm to see for themselves. As the officers walked through the farm, they found nothing out of order. The goats were fenced in, the chickens were quiet, and everything was clean and well maintained. Karen, watching from her yard, grew impatient. She couldn't believe the police weren't taking action. She marched right over to the officers, her face flushed with anger. "These animals are ruining our neighborhood," she snapped. "They're too loud, and they're stinking up the place." The officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with Karen's aggressive behavior. "Ma'am, we don't see any violations here," one of them said. "The animals are contained, and there doesn't seem to be any disturbance." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you serious? This farm doesn't belong here. It's lowering our property values." The officers remained calm, but it was clear they had no intention of shutting down the farm. "Ma'am, this farm is outside the jurisdiction of the HOA, the officer explained. "As long as they're following the law, there's nothing we can do." Karen couldn't believe what she was hearing. To her, this was a clear injustice. She had expected the police to back her up, to enforce the rules she believed should apply to everyone. Instead, they were siding with the farm owners. "You can't just let them do whatever they want," Karen shouted, her voice echoing across the neighborhood. By now, several neighbors had stepped outside, watching the scene unfold. Karen didn't care. All she cared about was getting rid of that farm, no matter what it took. One of the officers sighed, clearly trying to remain patient. "Ma'am, there's nothing illegal about what they're doing. They have every right to operate this farm as long as it's within the law. If you have a complaint, you can take it up with the local zoning board, but there's nothing more we can do here." Karen's frustration boiled over. "This is ridiculous," she yelled. "I'll take this to the highest level if I have to. You can't just ignore me." The officers, realizing there was no reasoning with Karen, calmly told her that the matter was closed. They thanked the family for their cooperation and headed back to their car, leaving Karen fuming in the middle of the street. As the police car drove away, Karen glared at the farm, her mind racing with plans for what to do next. If the police wouldn't help her, she would have to find another way to shut down the farm. She wasn't giving up that easily. Determined to get her way, Karen began devising a new plan. Since the police had failed her, she decided to take matters into her own hands. If she couldn't get the farm shut down through legal channels, she would have to find a way to make life difficult for the family. Determined to get her way, Karen began devising a new plan. Since the police had failed her, she decided to take matters into her own hands. If she couldn't get the farm shut down through legal channels, she would have to find a way to make life difficult for the family. Karen was no stranger to confrontation, and in her mind, this was a battle she couldn't afford to lose. She started by spreading rumors throughout the neighborhood. Karen knocked on doors, telling neighbors exaggerated stories about the farm. "Did you know those animals are carrying diseases?" she whispered to one neighbor. "I've heard their chickens are infested with lice," she told another. Most of the neighbors knew Karen's reputation for causing trouble, but there were a few who believed her lies. Soon, some of them started avoiding the farm, giving it strange looks whenever they walked by. But that wasn't enough for Karen. She needed something bigger, something that would force the family to leave. One night, she snuck over to the farm, careful to stay out of sight. Armed with a camera, she hoped to catch the family in some kind of violation. Maybe they'd let the animals roam too close to the road, or maybe the goats would escape their pen. Anything she could use against them would do. But the farm was well managed, and Karen's attempts to catch the family breaking any rules failed miserably. The animals were well behaved, the family was responsible, and there was nothing out of place. Days passed, and Karen grew more frustrated. Her camera footage showed nothing but peaceful scenes, exactly the opposite of what she wanted. Then, Karen had another idea. She decided to file repeated complaints with local government offices. She called the zoning board, animal control, and even the health department. Every day, she filed new complaints, hoping one of the departments would take action. "They're keeping livestock too close to residential homes," she insisted. "Their goats are causing an environmental hazard." Karen made up every story she could think of, trying to overwhelm the family with legal troubles. Each time an official visited the farm to inspect Karen's complaints, they found nothing wrong. The family had all the proper permits, the animals were healthy, and the farm followed all local regulations. Karen's constant complaints started to backfire. The officials began to view her as a nuisance rather than someone raising legitimate concerns. Despite her relentless efforts, Karen couldn't find any dirt on the farm. But she wasn't done yet. In her mind, she had to win, no matter what it took. Karen's next plan was to catch the family in the act of something illegal. She decided to set a trap. One afternoon, she placed a small bag of chicken feed just outside the farm's property line, hoping the chickens would cross over to eat it. If they did, Karen could claim the farm animals were invading public space, and she'd have photographic evidence to prove it. She waited patiently, her camera ready, sure that the chickens would take the bait. But once again, the family's careful management foiled her plan. The chickens didn't leave their enclosure, and Karen was left with nothing. Frustration turned to rage, and in a moment of desperation, she decided to escalate her tactics. Karen began dumping trash near the farm, hoping to make it look like the family was neglecting their property. She spread old newspapers, food scraps, and even plastic bottles along the edges of the farm, thinking this would finally get the attention of local authorities. Her plan, however, quickly fell apart. The family noticed the trash and immediately cleaned it up. They even installed a security camera near the property line, capturing footage of Karen sneaking around at night. When the family reviewed the footage and saw Karen's actions, they decided enough was enough. It was time to take a stand. They contacted the police and provided the footage as evidence. The officers, who had already dealt with Karen's false complaints before, were now armed with proof of her harassment. They knew it was time to put an end to Karen's antics once and for all. One evening, just as Karen was about to execute her next petty plan, the police showed up at her door. Her smug expression quickly disappeared when she realized why they were there. They had the footage of her trespassing and dumping trash on the farm's property. Karen tried to deny it, but the evidence was irrefutable. "This is harassment, ma'am," one of the officers said firmly. "We've received multiple complaints about your behavior, and now we have video proof that you've been tampering with private property." Karen's face turned pale. For the first time, she realized she was in real trouble. The officers explained that the family had pressed charges for trespassing and property damage, and she could be facing serious consequences if she didn't stop immediately. In that moment, Karen's world came crashing down. The very farm she had tried so hard to destroy had now turned the tables on her. She was the one being held accountable, and there was no way out. The officers issued her a citation, and she was forced to pay a hefty fine. Worse still, the entire neighborhood learned of Karen's antics, and she became the talk of the town. The once feared HOA enforcer had become a joke. After the police confrontation, Karen was left humiliated. Her reputation in the neighborhood was ruined, and her relationship with her neighbors was beyond repair. She kept to herself from that point on, no longer marching up and down the streets, making demands or complaints. The farm continued to thrive, and the family went back to living peacefully, grateful that the harassment had finally stopped. As time passed, the neighbors grew even more fond of the farm. It became a place where people could come to buy fresh eggs, vegetables, and even learn about gardening. The family often hosted small community events, bringing everyone together in a way that had never happened before. Karen, on the other hand, became a distant memory, a reminder of what happens when someone lets their pettiness take over. In the end, karma had come full circle. The family's kindness and patience paid off, and Karen learned the hard way that sometimes trying to bring others down only leads to your own downfall. The aftermath of Karen's downfall was felt throughout the entire neighborhood. Once the notorious figure of the community, she had now retreated into a life of isolation. Karen's once loud and bossy demeanor had all but disappeared. Neighbors no longer heard the sound of her angry knocks or her complaints about the length of someone's grass or the color of their fence. It was as if Karen had simply vanished, blending into the background of the very community she had once sought to control. For the family on the farm, life returned to a peaceful routine. With Karen no longer lurking around, they could focus on what truly mattered: their animals, their crops, and their growing relationships with the community. People visited the farm regularly, and it became a hub of activity for those who appreciated the fresh produce and the warm welcome they received from the family. The farm's goats became a neighborhood attraction, especially for the children who enjoyed feeding them during weekend visits. While the farm thrived, Karen's absence became more pronounced. At first, the neighbors couldn't believe it. How could someone who once controlled the HOA with an iron fist simply disappear? But disappear she did, and people were glad for it. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted, and the neighborhood seemed brighter, more alive. However, Karen's silence wasn't just a sign of her defeat. Behind her closed doors, Karen stewed in her own bitterness. She wasn't one to admit defeat easily, but the shame of her failed schemes weighed heavily on her. She spent her days watching from her window, her once powerful presence reduced to that of a silent observer. She had no friends left in the neighborhood, and even her closest allies within the HOA had distanced themselves from her, not wanting to be associated with her actions. Months passed, and Karen's absence from community life continued. But something had changed in her. With no one left to listen to her complaints, and no way to exert her control, Karen found herself reflecting on her behavior. The humiliation she faced had humbled her in ways she never thought possible. Without her usual power trips, she began to see the neighborhood for what it truly was, a place where people were just trying to live their lives peacefully. One day, Karen took a small but significant step. She left her house and made her way to the farm, where the family was busy tending to their garden. The family was surprised to see her. After all the trouble she had caused, they hadn't expected to ever see her again, especially not on their property. Karen stood at the edge of the farm, hesitant but determined. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't here to make demands or cause trouble. She was here to apologize. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Karen said quietly, her voice lacking the authority it once had. I caused you so much trouble, and I realize now how wrong I was. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to at least acknowledge what I did. The family, caught off guard by Karen's unexpected apology, exchanged glances. They had every right to hold a grudge, to turn her away and never speak to her again. But they also understood the value of forgiveness, and they knew that holding onto resentment would do them no good. We appreciate your apology, the mother of the family said, her voice kind but firm. What's done is done, and we're just glad it's over. We hope you've learned from this. Karen nodded, her eyes filled with the weight of her guilt. I have, she said softly. Thank you for hearing me out. After that day, Karen was no longer the woman the neighborhood had feared. She began to make small but meaningful changes in her life. She attended community events, not as an enforcer of rules, but as a participant who wanted to reconnect with the people she had once alienated. Slowly, the neighbors began to accept her again, though the road to rebuilding her reputation was long. The farm played a central role in Karen's transformation. She started volunteering there, helping with small tasks like watering the garden or feeding the chickens. At first, the family was cautious, unsure if Karen's change of heart was genuine. But over time, they saw that her remorse was real. Karen wasn't the same person she had been before. The power she once craved no longer held any meaning for her. For Karen, working on the farm became a form of redemption. It was her way of making amends for the chaos she had caused. She found peace in the simplicity of farm life, and for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged. The family, though wary at first, came to appreciate Karen's help. She wasn't perfect, and her past mistakes weren't easily forgotten, but she was trying, and that was enough. The neighborhood, too, changed in subtle ways. With Karen no longer ruling the HOA, the community became more relaxed. People felt free to make their homes their own, without fear of a knock on the door from Karen. The farm continued to grow, becoming a beloved part of the neighborhood, a symbol of resilience and community. Years later, the farm was still thriving, and the neighborhood had transformed into a close-knit community where people helped one another. The family had expanded their farm, adding more crops, more animals, and even hosting seasonal festivals that drew in people from all over the town. It became a place where memories were made, where children learned about farming, and where neighbors gathered to celebrate the simple joys of life. As for Karen, she had found a new purpose. No longer the antagonist of the story, Karen had become a part of the community in ways she never imagined. She wasn't the woman who called the cops on her neighbors anymore. Instead, she was someone who had learned from her mistakes and found a way to give back. Her journey had been one of growth, and though she would never forget the wrongs she had done, she had worked hard to make things right. In the end, the sweet karma Karen received wasn't just in the form of punishment. It was in the lessons she learned and the chance she got to change. The farm, once her target, had become her refuge. The family, once her enemies, had become her allies. And the neighborhood, once a battleground, had become a place of peace. Karen's story wasn't just one of getting what she deserved. It was a story of redemption, of second chances, and of finding a way to make things right when it seemed too late. The farm had survived Karen's wrath, and in the end, so had she.